Hello, I'm Christian Smith, and this is Talking Geopolitics from Geopolitical Futures. On this episode, we're taking a dive into the modern giant that is China. In the first of a series that we're calling the Encyclopedia of Geopolitics, our East Asia expert Philip Orchard will give us a country profile on China, a China 101, explaining the basic foundations of the world's second largest economy and what we often forget when approaching any question about it. Later on, Chairman and founder George Friedman will give us his views on China's external relations, in particular regarding probably its two most significant competitors, Russia and the United States. But to start with something completely different, I spoke with GPF Head of Analysis Alison Fedorka about what's on her radar and what she thinks you should be keeping an eye on in the world news pages of your morning paper right now. Alison Fedorka, tell us what's on your radar.
So I do like to keep an eye on Latin America, and right now there's a few different things going on, but the one that's catching my eye right now is the moves by the Nicolas Maduro government in Venezuela to try and maintain territorial control of its border region with Colombia. We've written about this on our site. You can see it, and you've seen some stories in the news over the past couple of weeks. And the reason why we care about this is because it involves the guerrilla groups from Colombia who have taken safe haven in Venezuela. They're having some skirmishes amongst themselves. This inherently brings in the Venezuelan military and government and puts into question the ability of the government and the military to maintain control over their territory. So over the past 6 months or so, we've seen an increase in the frequency of these types of disturbances taking place, as well as an increase in size. And while the latest episode has been calmed down for the time being, we are going to be keeping an eye out for repeats in the future.
Alison Fedorka, thanks very much. Now here at GPF, we try to strip away the hype of international affairs to explain what's really going on, to separate what matters from what doesn't. Understanding the restraints and influences on international players is key to analysing what drives day-to-day international interaction. So we're introducing an encyclopedia of geopolitics to explain the building blocks we use in our analysis of the world around us. Now when it comes to countries, in trying to understand a particular action by a nation in the international system, it's very easy to get caught up in the detail of the issue at hand. And in doing so, we tend to miss the broader context of motivations behind the rhetoric. When Russia masses troops on the Ukrainian border, are they really intending to invade? Or are they just playing up for their domestic audience? When Turkish and Greek fighter jets chase each other over the Aegean, is this an inevitable prelude to war? Or actually, is war between these two NATO powers almost impossible? And if so, what are they really trying to achieve? More often than not, what these dramatic acts appear to be on the surface can be easily explained as something less concerning if we know the fundamentals of what motivates those countries. Now, when it comes to China, little needs to be said to emphasise its importance in the modern world. But it is, of course, not simply just this enormous power that increasingly opposes the US. To understand what makes China China, why it does what it does, I spoke to our East Asia expert Philip Orchard to ask him to give us a country profile on China. Tell us, how does China's geography affect its behaviour?
In the core of the country, what we often call the ethnic Han core, the majority of the country, it's based around a couple river basins, particularly the Yangtze and the Yellow rivers. That's China's breadbasket. It's where the bulk of its people are. But its periphery historically has been what's guided its behavior and strategic impulses the most. And so, starting in, say, Tibet, they're surrounded by the Himalayan mountains, which so long as China controlled Tibet meant that they were basically impervious to invasion from that direction. To the south are the Himalayan foothills, which is, covered in jungle, impassable much of the year, filled with hill tribes, many of them often hostile to central governments. China has been a little bit vulnerable down from that direction, but not a lot. Usually it goes the other way. The places they've been vulnerable have been to the north, or especially to the northwest. If you think of the Mongol invasions, and the way that China has responded to that was by pushing outward into what's now Inner Mongolia, into Xinjiang, and so forth, basically trying to give itself strategic depth. And then there's the northeast, the Manchu, what historically was like the Manchu dominated areas. That's more than anywhere where China has been threatened in more recent times, thanks to the Japanese and so forth. And so the way it's pushing out there is by, for example, supporting North Korea's regime, basically doing whatever it can to keep hostile forces away from its border there. So those are its historical, and historically, whenever the Chinese central government was strong, it tended to control those areas. When due to economic reasons or due to any number of reasons, whenever the central area started to fragment and the central government started to weaken, you'd see these buffer zones, these peripheral regions start to break away. And so that's its historical focus. But now in the modern era, with China increasingly obviously engaged in the global economy and heavily dependent on exports to the US and Europe, heavily dependent on imports of commodities, especially oil and gas, but other things as well, from the Middle East, from Australia and so forth. Its geographic challenge now has moved, its foremost geographic challenge has moved to what's known as the first island chain, stretching basically from Japan all the way down to Indonesia. If hostile naval power were to block any number of choke points that are located along that string of islands, then China would be in real trouble.
Now, at the same time, economy and economic structure in particular is also pivotal. China's supposedly a communist country, but that's perhaps less relevant than it may seem. I mean, irrespective of ideology, how is China's economy restricting or influencing its behavior?
Right. So nowadays it's not communist in the sense of being a collectivist, Maoist style economy. It's a form of state capitalism, or there's lots of different ways to describe it, but that's basically it's a state dominated, or at least state much of it controlled form of capitalism. China has a massive labor pool, an increasingly well-trained or well-educated labor pool. It has incredible infrastructure and so forth. And that has made it indispensable to the world as sort of the world's factory or so forth. They saw what South Korea, what Japan, what Taiwan did after World War II and after the Korean War, taking advantage of their low labor cost, very savvily pouring state investment into industries that they felt like they would matter most in the future, and sort of slowly began climbing up what's known as like the manufacturing value chain, moving increasingly into higher end, sophisticated, higher technology sectors, doing that in a number of ways. They are innovating themselves. The main one early on, especially, was by inviting foreign companies in and then sort of just either gleaning or learning or stealing technology outright, and then over time figuring out how to do it themselves. And they've also, they invest very heavily in research and development. Their university system's getting better and better and so forth. And lots of Chinese immigrants who had worked overseas were willing to come home and help out the country's industry, develop and modernize.
And I mean, as you said earlier, it is very dependent on exports as well, isn't it? Is that still the case, or is that changing?
It is still very dependent on exports. They've been wanting to rebalance the economy away from exports, because over-dependence on exports obviously can become a problem if, for example, the U.S. economy crashed or Europe's economy crashed or something. You're dependent on the fortunes of your buyers to a large extent. So they've been, as China has grown richer from exports, that's also made it less competitive in some ways, at least in lower end industries. because Chinese labor costs have risen. So, companies increasingly started to look elsewhere for especially the low end stuff, to Vietnam, to Cambodia, and so forth. The healthy balance would have a much bigger emphasis on domestic consumption. And China's per capita GDP has grown by 1,000% over the past couple of decades. There's no reason to downplay it too much, but they still have a long way to go on a per capita basis to be able to catch up with advanced economies. To prevent China from ever entering into like a prolonged recession or anything, they've had to rely increasingly on investment, much of it from the state, much of it very speculative, and that's become less and less efficient over time, generating less and less return, and also started, especially since 2008, started creating all sorts of financial risk. And that's really China's biggest worry today, is some sort of cascading financial crisis that gets into their property sector and into their many different debt issues and so forth.
Well, Philip, that leads nicely, I think, onto a huge issue for China, which is demography, and in particular, resulting from that social stability. And I think that is in part from having such an authoritarian regime. That's a really strong constraint on the government there at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, and that really shapes the way they approach their economic model. Is they just feel like they cannot tolerate a major downturn, or at least a prolonged one, and so that prevents them from having a recession that burns off a lot of the inefficiency, and in the way that in most countries that are a little bit more open and market-based economies, recessions can be painful, but over the long term, they generally lead to new innovations and get rid of the weaklings and empower the surviving companies that are better, right? China, because they're so concerned about social instability, they'll do whatever they have to do basically to keep growth at least roughly stable. They've come to realize that they can't just have 10% growth every year until the end of time. As long as they can keep most people employed, they're obviously not going to have as many problems with protests breaking out in the streets or another Tiananmen Square or something like that. And so that really drives their fear of that, drives their thinking and their behavior on across their economic policy. And that is a big reason, why they're so afraid of a financial crisis, is it would quickly cascade into all sorts of areas.
That sort of social stability is also really important in terms of how China engages with the outside world. A lot of the sort of stuff we see in the South China Sea is in many ways actually just played up for a domestic audience. But at the same time, I mean, a country's military and its ability to, act militarily is always, and has since the dawn of time really been important in terms of international relations. So how does China's military, the position of its military, its strength, affect its actions?
There are good strategic reasons, as we touched on with the first island chain and so forth. There's obvious strategic reasons for them to be pouring so much money into their naval development, to their development of hypersonic missiles, anti-ship missiles, and so forth. And there's also very good political reasons. Simply put, most Chinese people are very proud of what China's becoming, and that gives the government much more breathing room on economic issues, quality of life, and so forth. So it's a very much a prestigious thing, but also a sound. The way they're developing their military does make a lot of sense in terms of what their strategic imperatives are.
Back to real basics. I mean, is it a strong, really competitive military? What's it dependent on? Where is it going?
It's so hard with these things because great powers never really fight wars, and China doesn't fight really anybody, or hasn't lately. And so they have a ton of ships. They might be good, they might not be. It's hard to say. It's a dangerous bet to assume that they aren't good. China, given their technological capabilities and their ability to get other people's secrets and designs and so forth, it's probably not a great bet to assume that everything would just collapse if they actually tried to use these things. But the other thing to think about is it's very well tailored around their specific strategic environment. So if the Chinese Navy and the U.S. Navy were to meet in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and start fighting, right, China wouldn't win. But that's not the battle that would ever be fought. what they're really focused on is sort of building out a buffer starting close to their coast and then enveloping Taiwan, then out to the first island chain and beyond. A buffer of air power, of anti-ship missiles, of electronic warfare systems, and so forth. And these zillion naval ships, Coast Guard vessels, these armed fishing vessels that they could use to just conduct swarm attacks and just harass foreign militaries. What they're doing, it does make a lot of sense in that standpoint, and it is already making it much, much more difficult for the U.S. to really think seriously about how it would fight a conflict close to Chinese shores or around Taiwan, for example. And the more they push out, the more the U.S. and its allies are going to have to think about how to deter Chinese aggression from a distance.
Philip Orchard, thank you so much for that. That was really, really interesting. And you can find all of Phil's excellent writing on East Asia and China in particular on the Geopolitical Futures website. He is our East Asia expert, and he's got some really great stuff on there. Thanks, Phil.
Talking Geopolitics is brought to you by Geopolitical Futures, your source for geopolitical forecasting and analysis.
For the second largest economy in the world, and an increasingly antagonistic one at that, it's no surprise that China's external relations are the focus of many a diplomat around the globe. On this episode's Fireside Chat with George Friedman, I spoke with George about China's foreign relations, and in particular, how it views its relationship with the US and Russia. George, it's a fact I think is often forgotten when thinking about China's place in the world, but its relationships with other countries, well, they're not very good, are they?
Think of it this way. The anti-Chinese alliance in the Pacific, which the United States is part of, includes Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines to some extent, Indonesia, Singapore, where the U.S. has bases, and also Australia. China has not a single ally with which it can operate militarily in the Pacific or really anywhere. The only country it's formally allied with is Pakistan. And the reason is most countries don't see much value in an alignment with China. Also, China has scared most countries. People who believe what China says want to be allied with others, and people who don't believe that, what they're claiming, tend to be hostile to them. So it's one of the key elements that is ignored about China, its isolation in the world.
You touched on it slightly there, George, but why does China not have closer, better, friendlier relationships with other countries?
Well, it begins with economics. China is in a desperate position economically. It is the world's largest exporter. It is facing the world's largest importer, its biggest customer, the United States, with hostile relations. Therefore, it tries to find other countries in the region to export to. Many of those countries are competing with China economically. So there's an entire dimension that we forget about China. It survives by exports. Its biggest customer doesn't want to buy from it, or not as much as it used to. Other countries feel the pressure from China. It's not necessarily good. The second reason is China is now taking to threatening. So, for example, if it's threatening an invasion of Taiwan, I think that would fail miserably. And moreover, you don't announce a country you plan to invade. But the other countries hear it. The Japanese hear it. The Filipinos hear it. Everybody in the region hears it. And they're thinking, after Taiwan, what? So China has, for domestic reasons, I think, painted itself as a extremely powerful power that is about to lash out, frightening everybody. And secondly, as a titan of international trade, which the Japanese, for example, doesn't want to hear. So China has convinced its population, and many, many outside, that it is an extraordinarily powerful country, but in fact it has many Achilles heels. One of them being the fact that if you're the largest exporter, you live and die by your customers.
So the US-China relationship certainly gets a lot of attention. It is possibly the most significant international relationship on the planet right now. How do you see it?
It begins again with economics. China systematically prevented American products from reaching the Chinese market. It had to. It was trying to build a domestic demand and domestic production, and the U.S. would be able to overwhelm it. The United States is a much larger economy than China's. The Americans came back with what almost any country would, saying, look, we want some access to China in exchange for you having access to the United States. The Chinese balked. They had to. As a result, the Americans basically said, well, if you're not going to allow us access, we're not going to allow you access, or we're going to carve it back somewhat and put sanctions and tariffs on China. The Chinese reasonably panicked. They had to have access to the largest market in the world. And the Americans refused to bend. I mean, they had no reason to bend. So the problem that the Chinese have is they must have good relations with foreign countries. They can't afford to really let those foreign countries have reciprocal relations with China, except on terms China defines. And it lost or is losing its largest customer. Now, I've been in business a little bit, and I have heard that don't irritate your biggest customer. Just don't do that, because he's going to stop buying. And that's what the Chinese did. And the Chinese are playing out that hand now, and the Americans are basically just holding their position and watching it happen.
The idea that there could be potentially a Cold War between the US and China is frequently discussed. I mean, to be fair, so is the idea of a second US-Russia Cold War, but that's perhaps a discussion for another day. But during the Cold War, the original one, the trade that went on between the Soviet Union and the United States was nothing like what we see today between the US and China. Do the economic ties between those two countries simply mean that a Cold War, in the sense of the previous one, is just not going to happen?
Well, there's more trade than we were thinking of at the time. There was tremendous trade in grains. Russia had to import them. Tremendous trade in oil, which Russia had and Europe needed to have. It wasn't emphasized, but it was going on because it had to go on. I think the issue here is that China can threaten war, but it's going to have difficulty waging one. For one thing, China has never fought a naval war, at least since 1895, when it was defeated by the Japanese. It has a lot of hardware, but the humanware, the trained admirals who have drawn on an institutional memory of warfare, aren't there. It is opening this by claiming that it is going to have an amphibious operation against Taiwan. Nothing is harder than an amphibious operation for two reasons. Firstly, getting the men to the right place is very tough, as we learned in Operation Overlord and other things in the Pacific. Secondly, you have to keep resupplying them. And the ships that are coming to resupply these men are highly vulnerable to air attacks. So the reason we are not going to have a war is, one, the United States has no desire to have a war with the Chinese, nor is it planning to allow the Chinese to dominate the Western Pacific. And the Chinese really don't have a geographical and strategic position where they can carry out an attack. And the biggest problem the Chinese have is they may lose. Whenever you start a war, as the Americans have learned in Vietnam and Iraq and other places, don't assume that you're going to win. And in the case of the United States, well, we endured the defeats. China has built itself internally as a heroic power. If it were to invade or try to invade Taiwan and lost, the regime would, I think, face serious challenge at home as to how that could have happened. So it's much better to threaten than to do. And therefore, I don't think either side is going to attack. The U.S. has nothing to gain from attacking China. We can't go anywhere. We can't go on shore. There's millions of them. And the Chinese have too much at risk to carry out that war. And in a sense, that's the same thing as why the Cold War ended the way it did. Each side was afraid of war. The Russians were terrified that it would lose a war. The Americans and the Russians were both frightened of nuclear weapons. The Americans had no reason to attack. They were just waiting. That's the game the Americans usually play. And in the end, what was the point? That was the interesting thing, that it ended in a whimper. The Russians went away. So I think it is like the Cold War. And like the Cold War, it never turned into a hot one, and probably couldn't because everybody's afraid of one.
Is our constant desire to see this as a new Cold War somewhat short-sighted? I mean, does it ignore the longer history of the world where, relationships between two powers that don't agree on everything, can be different to just a Cold War in the sense of what happened between the US and the Soviet Union?
Well, I mean, there's a confrontation. And when you're having a confrontation, it's at least one side is going to try to bluff. Because if the bluff becomes credible, and the Soviets bluffed and the Americans bluffed, the other side might back off. So the Chinese, without any allies, facing the possibility of dealing with the largest and most powerful navy in the world, and a very experienced one, is bluffing hostile actions. The United States is bluffing blockading Chinese ports because we're there in the South China Sea. We could close them off. We could close off the Straits of Malacca. Okay. Well, we have no intention of doing that. That would start a war. And the Chinese don't have anything. So what we're having here is not a reference back to the Cold War. It's the simple interplay between nation states that have serious issues with each other, none of which warrant combat, where each side tries to bluff the other into backing off. The difference is the Chinese are isolated and therefore have only a bluff. The United States is sitting there with an alliance structure that is really larger than NATO was, sitting back and not responding. Of course, the media will get all excited about this. They'll think that the Chinese have said they're going to invade Taiwan. Well, one of the guarantees is that if you're planning to invade a place, you don't name it months ahead because the other side can build up. And so we know that's not going to happen.
Well, speaking of building up and forces building up, I want us to take a look at China's relationship with Russia. Russia, of course, is currently quite prominently massing forces on Ukraine's border. And again, that may have to be a topic for another time. But historically speaking, China and Russia have struggled to be good friends, despite perhaps many normal indicators suggesting it might suit them very well. But in saying that, recently we've seen much more discussion about such an alliance's potential.
I don't know what an alliance would look like. China's problem is naval. The Russians, so it shows my age. The Russians do not have significant help they could provide the Chinese in confronting the West. The Russian confrontation in Ukraine or further west is ground warfare. The Russians don't need that kind of help. What the Russians need is tremendous investment out of China. That they would like. They still couldn't help the Chinese. What the Chinese would like was the Russians buying more of their goods. Well, the Russians can only buy so much. So when you look at an alliance, when you look at the Cold War and you saw the American alliance with, say, Britain beforehand, the two militaries were intertwined. The economy of Britain was dependent on the economy of the United States. The land of the United States was dependent on the invasion of Europe. This was an alliance in which each side had something to offer, in fact, were indispensable to the other. In the case of Russia and China, it's a concept, but when you take a look at how they would bear the burden of each other, Russia is not prepared to attack the West. I suspect not Ukraine either. because it depends on Europe to buy its products. It would be particularly its oil. It's not going to do that. And it can't do that. Its military isn't strong enough. The Chinese are going to be coping with the Americans and the Japanese and everyone else by themselves. The Russians can't come. So it would be another thing, to declare themselves allies. That's nice. Now, what are you going to do about it? Well, that becomes much more difficult. So alliance is a piece of paper. A working alliance, look at the U.S. and Britain in World War II, or the U.S. and Australia.
But I mean, there's a fair way between a full, US-UK style alliance and then standard relations between two countries. I mean, there's a big gap there that they could do lots with. Russia and China both, they often see themselves as disruptors in chief of the US-based world order. I mean, might an alliance actually look more like an agreement where they help each other to just make life difficult for the US and its allies?
The answer is specify help. What will they do for each other? So the problem here is there's one thing they could do. Simultaneously attack the United States. Russia by attacking Europe and NATO. China by attacking the fleet. That would be an interesting cooperation. The problem is the Russians are not that strong, and they're highly dependent on their relationship with Europe. They don't want to destroy Europe, God knows. And the Chinese, without that, are on their own, as they are now. So the really important thing when we talk about international relations are the details. You use various terms, relationships, alliances, many, many things. But when you ask the question, what exactly does that mean? What are you going to do for each other? Well, that's an issue. And this is the problem with China today. It puts itself as an adversarial relationship with the United States. It still has access to U.S. markets. That hasn't been cut off. Just some prices change. Were the U.S. to cut off their access to the United States, this would be a devastating blow. They don't want that to happen. We don't want that to happen. So we have this kabuki play, kind of like a New Zealand haka, and we're threatening each other, but we don't mean it. We don't expect a war with China. The Chinese don't expect a war with us. The Russians certainly don't. They're desperately trying to rebuild their economy, don't want to go into a war. We are in a peaceful period, not with small countries, but the great powers have far more to lose than they could gain in a war. And the risks to each of them are way too high. The U.S. is not going to attack China or Russia. Russia is not going to attack Europe, and the Chinese are not going to engage the U.S. fleet and everybody else in order to get more sales.
Well, a mention of New Zealand is always a good note to end on. George Friedman, thanks very much. And to you, I will say, ka kite anō, speak in a couple of weeks.
Take care. Bye-bye.
There are free articles available from George on the Geopolitical Futures website. All you need to do to find them is just go to geopoliticalfutures.com/podcast, and you can go from there. And that is all we have time for on this episode of Talking Geopolitics. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back again in 2 weeks, but until then, you take care.
You've been listening to Talking Geopolitics from the team at Geopolitical Futures. If you like what you've heard, be sure to subscribe to Talking Geopolitics wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love to hear your comments and questions. Go to geopoliticalfutures.com/podcast to leave your feedback. That's geopoliticalfutures.com/podcast.